it's not enough that Joe Biden is out of office in what, 6 months? Less than that, whatever the math is on January till now. 4 or 5 months. The United States doesn't just need a new driver. The United States needs a new direction. The new direction that the United States needs means radical shifts in our policy positions. So, is Kamala Harris's ascendancy, I'm going to ask that one more time. Is Kamala Harris's candidacy and her campaign for the presidency a signal that the United States' policy on Israel and Palestine is changing? It's a question. It's an important question. It's a necessary question. It's a question that I'm not sure we're prepared to answer just yet. But it's one that is becoming more and more urgent, because before it was an abstract question about what Kamala Harris might think about the world. We were just speculating. But right now we are facing an election cycle. And months before Biden dropped out of the race, Democrats were already anxious. They were concerned that President Biden's unshakable support of Israel and its war on Gaza would cost him the election. Why? Because of Muslim voters, because of other brown voters, because of college voters, because of other young voters. It just wasn't looking good for them. In March, a CARE survey showed that 72% of Muslim Super Tuesday voters disapproved of Biden's handling of the genocide in Gaza. Muslim Americans, of course, voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic ticket in 2020. But in battleground states that Biden won by razor-thin margins, Arab and Muslim voters, who make up a huge part of the electorate, are drawing a line in the sand. I'm talking about Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and of course, Michigan. In those states, voters were like, look, we're not rocking with you. We're not supporting you. Until you make a different policy choice, we're going to make a different voting choice. Right now, we're uncommitted. If you want us to be committed to you, then you got to commit to us. This is the position. They didn't vote Trump. They didn't wreck an election, as some of y'all like to say when y'all go around vote shaming people. They simply said, we're not voting Trump in the primary. And if you want us to change our position for the general, you're going to have to do something radically different. Now, Kamala Harris allegedly represents that something different. If you look back at Harris's actions in weeks following October 7th, just as an example, the vice president announced the development of, quote, the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter Islamophobia. So after October 7th, rather than simply blaming Muslims, rather than simply blaming Palestinians, rather than simply continuing to pile on the tropes, the Islamophobic tropes and the anti-brown tropes, Kamala Harris did something very different. She included Islamophobia in the conversation. She acknowledged that Islamophobia is something that is central to our discourse here in the United States. In fact, she also said this about a month after Hamas was attacked. She said, for years, Muslims in America and those perceived to be Muslim, which is an important point here. It's not, Islamophobia isn't just about Muslims, it's about people who people think are Muslim. If you're Sikh and you get beat up after something happens in the world and people think they're beating up Muslims, you're still the target of Islamophobia. Anyway, for years, Muslims in America and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks. As a result of the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we've seen an uptick in anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic incidents across America, including the brutal attack of a Palestinian American woman who was Muslim and the killing of her 6-year-old son. Well, That's not the most radical message. She's just saying, like, let's not be racist to anybody. But when I tell you, the world did not take that so well. Jewish people in America in particular did not do well on the whole with Vice President Kamala Harris's response. The announcement came after a poll commissioned by the Arab American Institute saw Biden's support sink to 17% among Arab Americans. So Kamala Harris is coming out speaking on this at that time, in again, about November, maybe a month after the October 7th attacks, because Muslim voters, Arab voters, were like, what are y'all doing? Where's the support? At that time, 40% said they would vote for Trump. So the question is, what does all this mean? We know, at the very least, that Kamala Harris is willing to stand up and speak out against Islamophobia, to speak out against racism against Palestinians, if the polls suggest it. Now, whether that's a legitimate feeling she has or whether it's always a political calculus, I don't know. I'm not in her head. What I can tell you is there's a direct relation between what the polls say and what these politicians be doing. So, in light of that, we have to ask substantive questions. On the internet right now, especially on Twitter, people are saying, oh, Kamala Harris is much more progressive on Palestine than Joe Biden. Where are the receipts? I have literally heard Kamala Harris defend the formation of the state of Israel, basically defend the Nakba. I have heard Kamala Harris repeatedly talk about the importance of Israel being created and the necessity of a Jewish state, but not just a state that protects Jewish people, but really a Jewish ethno-state. She's talking about the formation of Israel as it is right now. That is a problem. Kamala Harris called for a ceasefire. People on internet say, oh my God, look at Kamala Harris. She's not like Joe Biden. She's demanding a ceasefire. First of all, if y'all think that Kamala Harris made that statement and Joe Biden wasn't behind it, that wasn't a heavily orchestrated and curated conversation and speech, y'all out your mind. I promise you, Kamala Harris didn't say nothing about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, or October 7th without the approval and the handwritten notes coming from the big homie. And let's also be clear, Kamala Harris wasn't calling for a permanent ceasefire. She was calling for a long humanitarian pause. She was calling for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks of no violence. But by Kamala Harris's, demand, Israel will be right back at it in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. There would be no permanent ceasefire. It would only be a temporary one. That's what everybody wanted anyway, or was willing to do anyway, except Netanyahu's crazy behind, right? So people, even the allies of Israel were like, okay, you got to take a little break, y'all. Let people breathe. Let people get to safe havens, etc. That means nothing if you're going to start the war. It means even less if you're not going to disrupt the status quo on Israel-Palestine. We'll talk about this more in the week, but, to start, what are the policy shifts that people expect to see? This is where it becomes very important to understand that the United States' position on Israel has been bipartisan. Democrats just pretend to be willing to do something else. I'll give you an example. The Jerusalem Embassy Act. The Jerusalem Embassy Act was signed under the Clinton administration. A lot of people say, oh, Donald Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, signaling that they don't respect the international status quo. They don't respect Palestine's right to East Jerusalem at a minimum. They don't see a two-state solution, including Palestine, including Jerusalem for Palestinians. You can make all these claims based on the fact that Donald Trump moved the embassy, right? That most of the international community does not respect East Jerusalem as being Israel's. They say that it is contested. It is disputed. Why is this relevant? Well, because Donald Trump moves the embassy there, which Netanyahu loved. He probably gave him a big wet one, right? The next time he saw him for doing that. And so people say, look, see, Donald Trump is doing more craziness. No, but the Jerusalem Embassy Act was actually signed under Bill Clinton. And then what they did was, because nobody wants to go down for Israel Palestine in this country as a presidential candidate, they said, well, we'll make a waiver. And every 6 months or so, you can sign the waiver, and then you don't have to move the act. But the Jerusalem Embassy Act was signed and approved by Congress and the president, President William Jefferson Blythe Clinton, Bill Clinton. And so signing the bill is one thing, because you get all the credit from the Zionists and from the right wing for doing it. But then when it's time to actually move the embassy, you just sign the waiver saying, I will wait another 6 months. The entire Clinton presidency, they waited those 6 months. The entire George Bush era, they signed the waiver and kicked the ball down the field. The entire, after George Bush was Obama, the entire Obama administration, they refused this similarly to move the embassy. They just kept signing the waiver. So when you look at Donald Trump as somebody who radically changed Israel Palestine, you have to understand he just did what they all promised to do. He didn't do, him acknowledging the goal line. All these things are things that Democrats and Republicans have committed and promised to do. So I say all that to say, and I promise you'll see these dots connect. Kamala Harris might be as progressive as any Democrat ever on Israel Palestine. That is such a low bar. Saying that she'll be better than Trump is not saying much. But the question is she actually better than Trump on this issue? Nothing she has said suggests that she's better. Now, we know Donald Trump, he has no driving ideological force behind him. He is simply wants to control the world. He wants to amass power, and all the ideologues, whether it's the John Boltons of the past or whoever, they weigh in with their ideologies, and their ideology shaped the presidency, but it's not Trump's. So when you say a shift, will Kamala Harris signal a shift in U.S. Israel policy? It's like, it's not just enough to have the policy. You also have to be willing to execute and implement the policy. And you also have to ask yourself, well, what is our end goal here? Because you don't even know if you've made progress on Israel Palestine if you don't know what the goal is. If I looked at the Oslo Accords of '93, or I looked at the Clinton Accords of 2000, and I looked at it, I said, well, look, here's what they were trying to do. It's great. Someone could easily pick that apart and show how what I thought was progress isn't, or vice versa. So what is our end goal? If our end goal from the Clinton Accords, or from even also earlier, 7 years earlier, if the goal is a real Palestinian state and two-state solution, or a one-state reality solution because of the one-state reality, that's all. Whatever you all say is up to y'all. But my point is, if I don't know what your goal is, I can't assess if you have been successful. I can't succeed. I can't assess if you're making progress toward that goal. But I'm not optimistic. I'll just say that. So, when it comes to Kamala Harris in U.S. Israel policy, I'm not sure that there will be a radical change, but there has at least be radical speech. There at least has to be progressive. I'll just say it. Let me simplify this even more. At the end of the day, Kamala Harris has to articulate a policy agenda on every issue. Where do you stand on reparations? Where do you stand on abortion? Where do you stand on defunding and abolition? Where do you stand on these issues? And the only thing I want to see are her answers. And the only thing I'm going to assess those answers against is her actual conduct. I don't care who she's married to. I don't care about all these ancillary and superficial things about, who you're married to and all that. I don't want to hear about any of that. I'm going to give Kamala Harris the fairest shot possible and ask her what her positions are. And I just need the answers to that. It's that simple.